Thank you so much for kindly waiting, Mr. Ambassador. As I mentioned before, the short break, we can now perhaps talk about the trade relations between Brazil and the Philippines. Can you update us on that, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, we have a bilateral trade flow that reached a peak in 2014 when the total trade amounted to around $1 billion US. Since then, it has decreased somewhat due to two factors. One, the decrease in the exports of Brazilian iron ore to the Philippines. And the second one is the economic recession that has been hitting Brazil for the last 2 years. And it has been particularly severe in the last 2 years, and of course this provokes or induces a negative effect on bilateral trade. But we have been working very hard to identify promising sectors or areas where there could be new opportunities for investment and trade between our two countries. We are awaiting a very important business delegation from Brazil who should arrive here in mid-July this year, headed by the governor of one of the main agricultural exporters states in Brazil, the state of Goiás. And we are also participating in a bid by the Philippine Air Force to buy 6 new aircraft, and our aircraft manufacturer Embraer is participating in this bid. So this could give a new boost to bilateral trade. We hope so.
May we move on now to education, Mr. Ambassador? Are there any existing educational programs between Brazil and the Philippines?
Well, you know that we are separated not only by geographical distance, but also by an 11-hour time difference. Brazil and the Philippines are located exactly on the opposite sides of the globe. So if you think of a Brazilian who initiates his trip to the Philippines, in Brazil he will take a day and a half just to reach his destination. Well, that distance is the main reason that explains why there are still few Brazilians living or working or studying here in the Philippines. And the same thing can be said about the Filipino community in Brazil. We still have to overcome a relative lack of knowledge of our respective peoples, about our realities, our societies, and our cultures. We share some values, some principles, but we should work very hard to overcome this lack of knowledge.
Having said that, maybe we can now touch on the universal common denominator among countries, which is sports. What do you think can we do together to promote this between our two countries? Are there any sports programs in place?
Well, we in Brazil, Brazil is a sports-crazy nation. We love sports, and we hosted the Olympics last year, and we had hosted the Soccer World Cup in 2014. And for us, football is by far the most popular and important sport. It's almost like a religion in Brazil. And unfortunately here in the Philippines, the stage of development of football is almost amateur. So that makes it more difficult to consolidate a deeper cooperation between the two countries. But anyway, we have been sending some coaches and players to the Philippines, but in very limited numbers. And we have been also participating in some local competitions or regional competitions involving volleyball teams. Last year there was a World Women's Club competition, and one team from Rio de Janeiro took part in that championship. And but by far, football is the most important sport in Brazil. I personally think that football is the most suited sport for the Filipino biotype. You know, You don't have to be very tall, you don't have to be strong. Anyone can play football. You just have to be to have the talent to play it. The best player in the world is a short man, Messi from Argentina. Other very good players in the history of sport, of football, were also short. So, and I know that football was more popular in the Philippines some decades ago, I think in the 50s or 60s. But after that, basketball consolidated itself as the most popular sport. We are also trying to use football as a kind of tool for social inclusion. We do it in Brazil. We have a lot of programs to spread the practice of football. That's a way for young people to learn the importance of values such as respect, discipline, teamship. That's also a way to keep them away from dangerous vices like drugs.
Now, let's move on to the lighter side but equally engaging topic of discussion. You've been here in our country for slightly over a year. Since you arrived, which leisure destinations have you visited here in the Philippines?
Well, with my job as ambassador, I have visited some big cities in the Philippines, like Cebu or Davao, but also tourist destinations. I went to Tagaytay, to Batangas 2 times each. I went to Vigan in Ilocos Sur. I went to the island of Palawan, to El Nido. I loved it. And we are planning a trip to Boracay next summer when my son comes to visit us. And we have a friend who has a unit in a condo in Boracay, and we are just planning it. We loved our stay in El Nido, and if I had to recommend a specific beach in the Philippines, I would recommend all that region, El Nido. It's fantastic. It's unique in the world.
Having been to your country once, Mr. Ambassador, I know for a fact that Brazil has quite a significant share of beautiful beaches in the world. Would you also consider recommending other beaches here in the Philippines? Since you've already mentioned Palawan, what other tourism destinations would you consider recommending to Brazilians if ever they come to visit our country?
Well, just the other day I was talking to a friend of ours who came to the Philippines to make a documentary on the wonders of the country, and she was very enthusiastic about Cebu and Bohol. And she also went to Coron, which is relatively close to El Nido. And she recommended me all those places. And, of course, if I had time, I would spend my whole time here traveling all around the country. But I have to stay here in this fantastic city, Metro Manila, away from the beach.
Tell us, Mr. Ambassador, how else can we further promote travel between Brazil and the Philippines?
Yeah, we don't have many Brazilians living here. The number of tourists is increasing, but it's relatively small so far. Our records show that between 10 and 20,000 Brazilians visited the Philippines last year. And as we don't need visas, a Brazilian doesn't need a visa to enter the Philippines if he wants to enter as a tourist. So this is an estimate between 10 and 20,000. We have to take into consideration that the geographical distance is a factor that we have to take into account, and also that relative lack of knowledge. For this, I think that very targeted tourist campaigns, promotion campaigns are important. These campaigns should include not only the tourist boards or the tourist official agencies, but they should have the participation of the airlines, of the hospitality industry, and also the private sector, the companies that participate more actively in the tourist and the trade and investment flows between the two countries. And those campaigns should highlight the differences and similarities between each country and its neighbors. So the Brazilians should be able to tell the difference between the Philippines and Thailand or Indonesia or Malaysia, and Filipinos should tell the difference between Brazil and Argentina or Chile. It's important to stress the differences and also point to some similarities or convergences. But that takes time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for the time you share with us, so we and our viewers can get to know you better and also give us more knowledge about the existing friendly relations between our two countries and the bilateral efforts to improve these relations. Before we end this very engaging conversation, would you have any message to our viewers?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think that we, despite that distance, that relative lack of knowledge, we have many principles and values that we share as very diversified countries with multicultural societies. We have similar challenges to have a better standard of living, and we have a very wide and important environmental heritage, both our countries. And we also have very solid democracies. That's something we have to value very highly. Brazil is a very open country. We receive with open arms foreigners. We have been doing this throughout our history. We are a nation of immigrants, living, studying, or investing in Brazil. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and the Brazilian Embassy in Manila is open and at the disposal of every Filipino who wants to get a more accurate knowledge on Brazil.
Thank you once again, Mr. Ambassador. It has been a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you.
His Excellency Rodrigo do Amaral Souza, Ambassador of Brazil to the Philippines, our most distinguished guest this week on Embassy Row.